Good evening to all, and thank you for being here tonight for Yorktown's 5th Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony. I would like to thank our participants, religious leaders, my fellow board members, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Eliza Erber, and rabbinical pastor, Dr. Eliza Erber, but from now on I will refer to you as Eliza, as you request. Eliza, sorry. I'm nervous enough, Eliza. You're killing me. Without their collaboration in this event, it would not be possible. I also want to take a second to thank and say prayers for our 4 previous speakers, Sam Matza, Peter Voigas, Peter Samoji, and Esther Geisels, who unfortunately last year passed away. This remembrance came to be after discussions between the former supervisor, Michael Grace, and myself. The conversations began not in the past, but rather with current events. The reoccurring theme was based on the quote by Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana of, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Seeing what was happening in Syria, Yemen, the Sudan, and China is part of it, but this is the end result of a societal acceptance. It is not the root cause of the issue, and you only fix an issue by fixing the cause. Today we can add the Ukraine to this list. The atrocities that are happening there have been compared to the methods of and modus operandi of the Germans under the Nazi Party. If looking to the past were enough, these are examples to choose from before the Holocaust. There are examples to choose from before the Holocaust ever started. We could go back to the Inquisition, or even more recent to the Holocaust, look at the plight of the Armenians in 1915 through 1923. There were also pogroms in Russia against the Jewish population in 1907 through 1908 that saw thousands killed for their religious beliefs. These pogroms led to my paternal grandparents leaving what is now Pavlok, Ukraine. At the time, there were over 15,000 Jews living there. Many left during the Russian Civil War. In 1941, the Nazis drove into Pavlok, had the remaining Jews in the town dig a mass grave, and then they were executed and thrown into the grave. To this day, there are no Jews living in Pavlok. I want to repeat some words from some of our past remembrance ceremonies. We need to look at the present. We should look at our political leaders and those who wish to serve. Are they talking about what they wish to do different, or are they trying to get you to hate the other person? We could look at our media and the responsibility of reporting rather than creating the dialogue. We can look at the populace to see if they are accepting the questionable without questioning it. We should look at all of this because this is a formula that has been used over and over. Since these words, we have had members of Congress and the New York Times criticized for anti-Semitic speech and cartoons. We had multiple hate shootings at religious institutions and public venues. The governments that have performed these atrocities I spoke about have controlled the media, and the media have controlled the citizens. None of these crimes against humanity started overnight. They all started with a message of hate that was either accepted or received with indifference, and indifference can be the same as moral acceptance. Some nations were overrun by the Nazis and forced to accept these atrocities, but some nations were knowing participants. We are here tonight to remember the Holocaust and to keep alive the memories so that they are at the least a tool for future generations to look to when fighting against the hatred. The Holocaust did not start overnight. Hitler ramped up the hatred of Jews for 8 years before the more radical final solution was brought forward. Even today, the magnitude of what happened, 12 million murdered. 6 million of these Jews, 60% of the Jews living in Europe, 91% of the Polish Jews, 87% of the Greek Jews. These numbers are incomprehensible. They defy what our minds can wrap around as possible. This is why we must remember our first speaker, local resident Sam Matza, who, as a survivor of the Greek Holocaust. The 2 speakers after that, Peter Samoji and Peter Voigas, were both from Budapest, but shared very different stories. Over 559,000 Hungarian Jews, or 70%, perished in the Holocaust. Our last speaker, who unfortunately passed away, as I mentioned, this past December, Esther Geisels, was born in Lodz, Poland in 1929. Her experience in being sent to multiple concentration camps and her escape during the infamous Death March. Tonight we are blessed to hear from rabbinical pastor Dr. Eliza Erber and her story of her search for answers. We are here to let our voices be heard, that crimes against our fellow man are not acceptable, and that we will never stand still for these actions in our society. We are here to light a candle for humanity, to serve as a beacon for our children to follow as they try to create a world of unity and peace. Thank you. And for our invocation this evening, I'd like to ask Father Ryan Mardoon from St. Patrick's Church to come to the podium.
Good evening to you all. My name, as Ed said, is Father Ryan Muldoon, and my day job is here in Yorktown Heights as the Associate Pastor of St. Patrick's Parish. But I have the chance once a week to venture down county to Yonkers, where I'm an Associate Professor. I teach our men who are studying to be Catholic priests. And I have the privilege of teaching them a course in the Catholic Church's relations with other Christians, with Judaism, with Islam, and with other world religions. I've just come back this afternoon. We've just wrapped up our section on relations with Judaism. And I feel really strongly about instilling in my students a deep and abiding appreciation for the spiritual ties between Jews and Christians. We share a heritage. It's not one's or the other's, it's ours, together. But despite this tie, despite this shared heritage, as a Christian, I have to admit with honesty that 2,000 years of relations between Jews and Christians has been fraught, largely negative, in fact. But in the last number of decades, there are reasons for hope. Reasons for hope in the closeness of our communities, and this gathering here tonight to remember the Holocaust, to observe Yom HaShoah, is another reason for hope. And so I ask pardon for the ways that anti-Semitism was present in the Catholic Church throughout history. It's sad as we witness the rise in anti-Semitism in today's society, but we gather here tonight to say that there is no place for anti-Semitism, not in the Catholic Church, not in any community of faith, not in this community, and not in our world if we have anything to say about it. I shudder to think that a third of Jews worldwide lost their lives in the Shoah. And where? In the heart of predominantly Christian Europe. Never again. In 1994, John Paul II, then Pope, was speaking at an event commemorating the Shoah, and he said that if our words about the Holocaust, like our words here tonight, he said they cannot be mere words, but they must be a binding commitment to one another. And so may our presence here tonight together be a binding commitment to one another, that we as people of goodwill would commit as brothers and sisters, as members of one human family, to say never again. And so let us pray. Lord our God, we gather this evening to remember. We gather to remember those whose lives were lost in the Shoah, especially those of our Jewish brothers and sisters. We gather to remember those lives and families that would never be the same because they had walked in the valley of darkness. May you be the one who seals our binding commitment to always remember the tragic ills of the past, that we may never repeat them again. Lord, forgive our indifference, forgive our hatred, forgive all that has and would divide the one human family you have formed. Even as humanity has walked in the valley of the shadow of death, the 23rd Psalm reminds us that we need fear no evil, for you are at our side with your rod and your staff to give us comfort. And I conclude with the simple prayer penned by Pope Francis in a visitor's register when he made a stop at Auschwitz. Lord, have mercy on your people. Lord, forgive us for so much cruelty. Glory to you forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you very much, Rod. Appreciate that. At this time, I would like to ask Rabbinical Pastor Dr. Aliza Erber to come to the podium.
Thank you all for being here today. It's very, very meaningful. And I would like to thank Father for very inspiring words. Never again to any hatred. Thank you. So, the opportunity to honor those who have perished in the Holocaust, in the Shoah, and tell their story is a really precious gift that sometimes I find rather overwhelming. But I don't just want to honor those who perished. I think it's also important to honor those ones who survived and were able to build for themselves new lives with new spouses and new families. They married again and they had their children, and in view of what they went through, think about how much courage it took to just pick themselves up and move forward. So, we do have this presentation. Okay. So this is my Austrian-Dutch family, right there. And I thought of them always when I talk about them as just an ordinary European family. My grandfather, the guy over here with the mustache, can you see him? Okay. He made his living through art. He was an artist, a painter, a really good one, and he actually made a living at being an artist. He was very talented, and he was successful. He was originally from Vienna, Austria, and my mother, Helga, was born in Vienna. She is the one standing over here. She's about 15 years old in this picture. This is pre-everything, and the whole family was there together. But shortly after she was born, her mom passed away, and my grandfather, her father, took her to Holland, where the rest of the family lived. And my mom was brought up. Is it okay if I turn my head? Can you still hear me okay? Okay. And she was brought up by her two aunts. This is Tante Emma, Tante meaning aunt Emma, and this is Tante Ella. And Tante Emma had these two sons, one of which got engaged. This was his girlfriend at the time. And so she had a good life. She was doted upon. She was very spoiled. She had her own German shepherd, and the family did very well while they were there. They were well-to-do, and my mother was spoiled and doted upon and had her own German shepherd. I think I just said that. And the family also had a cook and two chambermaids. Wow. My mother's dog was named Luxie, and I'll come back to Luxie a little bit later. My mother, from a very young age, took after her father and showed a lot of talent as an artist. And from a young age already, she was accepted into one of the very prestigious art schools in The Hague. She didn't paint for many, many, many years after the war, but when they went back to Israel, when my family went back to Israel after living in the United States for many years, she took up sculpture. And this is one of her sculptures. My mother grew up in a very secular, non-religious home. She knew very little about Judaism altogether, and if she ever thought about her religious affiliations at all, she probably would have thought of herself as Christian. Her grandmother, my grandfather's mother, Oma Babette, was born and raised Roman Catholic in Budapest, Hungary. As a young woman, Oma Babette, Oma meaning grandma, Oma Babette went to Vienna on vacation. She went to the theater, saw the actor on the stage, fell in love, and I'm making him the lead actor, but truly I don't know if he was or not, but since I like to be on the stage myself, and he, after all, was my great-grandfather, right? Even if I never met him, his genes came down the line. And, well, so they married and had 3 children. And Richard, my grandfather, with the mustache, and his 2 sisters, Emma and Ella. They were raised marginally as Roman Catholics in Holland, and I think a Christmas tree was about it, okay? So the fact that my great-grandmother married a Christian, married a Jew, and he married the Jew married a Christian, really didn't impact on their lives at all. It didn't matter at all. Their lives were good, and they respected the community, respected each other, and that part of it really didn't matter much. Of course, until the Germans came. And the way my mother told it was that, well, one day they were there. They were just there. And she tells of a story where she and her dog, Luxie, were looking down out the window, and they were marching down the main street. I mean, really marching, more and more and more of them coming in. So the Nazis entered The Hague on May 16, 1940, when my mother was 16 years old. And life, as everyone knew it, changed immediately and drastically. The German plan was to capture Queen Wilhelmina, the Queen of the Netherlands, and have her surrender, and thus defeat the Dutch. Well, this did not happen, as she was whisked off to London immediately. The changes came swiftly. At first, there were signs tacked onto trees and bulletin boards, and signs such as Jews are forbidden to walk in the park. Jews may not shop in Christian stores. And most importantly, Jews must register. Now, the minute you register, they have your info, and it's very hard to hide. Things continued to get dramatically worse. Every day there were more notices posted about things that she, as a Jew, could no longer do. The simple pleasure, as I said before, about walking in the park with her girlfriends was now forbidden to her. Her best friend, Miep, not a Jew, was able to, but my mother, the Jew, could not. Then she had to relinquish her bike. Now, in Holland, especially in that time, everybody bikes. That was the mode of transportation. You got on your bike and you went. But as a Jew, Jews had to relinquish their bikes. And Miep, her friend, came to their apartment almost every day. This was pre-hiding days. And there was pre-hiding days when already the underground was forming and the resistance movement in Holland was being put together. And that's a very, very important point. They were very, very effective and strong. And all of a sudden, my mother and her family, secular at best, now were Jews. Hitler had instituted the blood laws. So if somewhere in your family tree someone had married a Jew, now you too were a Jew. Even if you had converted to Christianity a long time ago. I'm always getting this backwards a little bit, but I think you know what I'm trying to say with this. But I must say that there was still a little bit of joy during that time because my mother's friend Miep got engaged to Hans, my mother's cousin, one of the two cousins, and they planned to get married. Another thing that never materialized. So at first, Jewish men began to disappear. Then Jewish families began to disappear, and food became scarce. Now, at first, these people who disappeared came back, often severely beaten, but they came back. And then, of course, came a time when they no longer returned. And that happened to Tante Emma's husband, my great-uncle, Leopold. He was taken to Gestapo headquarters, never returned home. They never found him again. They didn't know what happened to him. They couldn't find out. They tried. And especially with me not being Jewish, she could go to Gestapo headquarters. She could try more things than my family could. But he never returned home. Following Uncle Leopold's disappearance, my mother's Aunt Emma plunged into a depression, and my mother assumed the care of the household. Now, the cook was gone, the chambermaids were gone, since Christians were no longer allowed to work for Jews. The cook was gone, and the nanny. So my mother now had to grow up fast. Like everyone, on top of her domestic duties at home, my mother, Helga, like everyone else, spent hours trying to track down food, find food to feed her family. And she also, even though she really didn't talk about that, she didn't talk about the Holocaust at all when I was a girl. She joined the underground as well and became a partisan fighter. But I don't know what she did because she refused to talk about it. In 1942, my grandfather received notice through the underground again that our family was now put on a deportation list. I was not yet born. That meant that the time had come for my family to immediately go into hiding. Now, these hiding places for the rest of the family had been arranged months earlier because my grandfather knew, he understood that the day was going to come that our family would be targeted as well. So they all dispersed. There really was no place for me arranged because they didn't know I was coming. So one of the first places where my mother hid was with a Dutch farming family, the Leffers family. They already had 8 children, and after lightening my mother's hair a bit, because they were all pretty light, she just blended right in as a child number 9. And they were very, very nice, but you have to understand that they got paid to hide a Jew or more than one with them. And I can't fault them for that, is because they too, even though they were on a farm, had 8 children and they needed food. They needed money to survive and to give to the Germans so that they wouldn't look too strongly into their affairs. And you also have to understand that this farmer took his life, his wife's life, and his 8 children's lives he put it on the line. If, for heaven's sakes, they would have found my mother, and actually there was another person, a French person hiding, they would have been all shot immediately over there. So after a while, however, she stayed for numerous months, but after a while she was told that she had to leave because Nazi patrols increased in that area. And she would have to go and hide in a barn. They had one or two barns, and go underneath the hay. And she tells that at one time she was underneath the hay and trembling and scared. Now, my mother was still a teenager. You know, she was a pregnant teenager. And she said that the Germans came into the barn where she was at and with their bayonets started sticking into the hay. They missed her, thank goodness. I cannot for the life of me picture myself lying under the hay with those bayonets going all around me. The trauma of it alone. Yeah. So then she did have to leave and find other hiding places. And she said that she often slept during the day. I mean, I forget now. But she would sleep when the Germans were not going around and looking. And she told me that she slept in ditches, in other barns, in the forest, wherever she could. Now, remember that food was also very, very scarce. And when I was born, my mother said I was very, very small, and I fit almost into the palm of her hand. And that's pretty much because she had no nourishment at all to help. So I don't know how she survived or how she reconnected with her own family later on. My mother's grandmother, Oma Babette, as I mentioned before, was a Roman Catholic who had raised her 3 children, including my grandfather and his two sisters, marginally as Catholics. Eventually, however, years later, at the age of 85, Oma Babette was rounded up by the Nazis and transported to Auschwitz, where, according to historians, 1.1 million Jews were murdered. Now picture this. At the age of 85, she survived the long and horrific trip in a windowless cattle car without any toilet facilities or water. Body crowded body against body with the others, and she survived, only to be murdered immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz. This is a stock photo of people being loaded onto a cattle car. Of course, I couldn't find the one that Oma Babette was on, but there are many of them online. And this, to me, is probably what it looked like. And as you can see, the people had hope. They took their suitcases with them. They had no idea of what it would be like where they were going. This is Cousin Kurt, one of my mother's cousins, and one of the reasons that I have put his picture there is, A, I found it, so I could put it, but C is and this especially I point out to young children, he was wearing the Jewish star that was mandatory, the yellow Jewish star. But he looks pretty happy still. It does. I think this was in the earlier days, and that he even has a cigarette, so his life hadn't really changed all that much, except that he was part of the underground, which eventually ended up killing him. So both he and his brother, Cousin Hans, at the age of 32, and Kurt, who was 36, were caught while working for the underground, or with the underground. It took many weeks of frantic visits by Miep to Gestapo headquarters to try and find out where her fiancé was at this point. The 2 brothers, together with other members of their cell, because they were an underground cell, were caught and sent to concentration camp, where they died as well. This was told to me by my Aunt Betty, herself a 4-year-old hidden child of the Holocaust. My grandfather had remarried after my mother's mom had passed away, and he married the person I considered to be my grandmother, and they had two daughters. So Betty and I are very, very close to today. She's 85 years old now, and I don't really have the exact timeline of how they were caught and all of that, but this is what Betty was able to tell me. The next picture that I have over here to show you is of Richard and Helga. Helga was my mother. Richard was my biological father. And this is before he was caught and sent to concentration camp in Holland called Westerbork. So a year or two earlier, my mother met a friend of her cousin, Hans, and they became a couple, engaged to be married. Richard Levy, my father, was 14 years older than my mother, and like the rest of the family, he was part of the underground resistance fighters. Now, this was the man that she would later marry. This was the man who was my biological father, and this is the father I never met. Richard's job with the underground was to identify families who were slated for deportation and smuggle them out. At one such time, he was caught, Richard was caught, arrested, and after being held in a prison for a few weeks, he was transported away to the Dutch concentration camp of Westerbork. And again, it took weeks to discover what happened to him. And they did. They found out that he was at Westerbork. In the beginning at Westerbork started out as a transit camp because when things became really bad in Germany for the Jews over there in Austria, a lot of them started running away from those countries, and they came to the first country they could, and that would happen to have been Holland. Holland didn't know what to do with so many refugees that were coming over the border, so they sent them to Westerbork to stay there until they could figure out where. But before you knew it, the Germans took over, and it became a concentration camp. No food and hard labor. It was not an extermination camp. So Westerbork, as I said, had its own rules and its own things, but still it was a place where you could have hope that you will survive. On Tuesdays, those were the dreaded selection days, because on Tuesdays, the prisoners who got very ill or were starving or couldn't work anymore, they were selected to be transported out to the extermination camps, in Poland or other places. So although the prisoners at Westerbork didn't believe that any camp could be any worse than what they were already experiencing, slowly stories started to filter back about death by firing squads and death in a gas chamber. On November 25th, or in November of 1942, my mother received permission from the Judenrat, from the Jewish Council, to go visit Richard at the camp. And on November 25th, they were married there. And this is a very precious document to me. It's a marriage certificate from Westerbork. It says right up there, Westerbork concentration camp. Not many people got married in a concentration camp. And my father's information is on one side, including the names of his parents, and then my mother over here, and it's signed by the camp commandant. And when I no longer have use for these documents, I'm going to give them to the Holocaust Museum in the city. In my early years, growing up, my mother never spoke about Richard. I didn't even know he had existed. I didn't know that Bert, the man that I thought was my father, was not. Years later, she opened up a little bit and started telling me. She told me that Richard was the eternal, because I had that one picture, we had that one picture, and my mother told me that Richard was the eternal optimist. He always believed that Westerbork was but temporary. You know, he was only going to be there for a short time and a short stop before he would return home. And I have a letter that he has written to my mother. Now, this letter is more than 80 years old, and it's on very, very thin paper, and it's written on both sides because paper was very precious to have at the time. And in this letter, he talks about the prisoners trying to organize a party because they wanted to boost the morale because they were already starving and conditions were very, very difficult. He also asks my mother to send a care package of food because there was no food. And he also, even though he doesn't spell it out in so many words, he asks her if she went to see the doctor because he suspected that she was already pregnant with me, and she was. The letter was written on September 6, 1942, 6 weeks before they were married and 7 months before I was born. Westerbork was also the first of 3 and 4 or 4 concentration camps where my father was sent to, where he was a slave laborer. And I do not know much about his time there because there's no one who can tell me about it. But he caught at Theresienstadt or Terezin, he caught typhus and also acute dysentery. And I found him at Theresienstadt. And from there, he was transported to Auschwitz, probably because he was so very sick with the typhus. And this is the transport list I found in the records room at Theresienstadt. And this was very difficult for me. I went there, and there was a lovely young lady sitting there manning the archives that were there. And I gave her my father's name. It took her less than 30 seconds. She bent down, took out a book, a blue ledger book, opened it up to page 6, I think, and there the 12th name down was Richard. I circled it in yellow to see. So that was the transport list. There are other numbers on it. One of them, I think, might be the number that was tattooed on his arm, but I don't know. I don't know. And at Auschwitz, he succumbed to the deadly disease of typhus and died at the end of August 1944, when I was already 1 year and 4 months old. I have a sworn statement, again, a very precious document, from 2 Auschwitz survivors who had known my father at the camp and were eyewitnesses to his death. I was born on April 2nd, 1943, and this month I celebrated my 80th birthday, in a small town called Almelo, where my family hid to get away from the Nazis. It was felt at the time that the Nazis were less likely to search in such a small town, but that was not so, because they ended up coming to the town and my mother had to literally disappear. And in my case, since I didn't have a prearranged hiding case, I was put into this bunker underneath the ground. I think it's about 10 by 10, I don't know exactly, but it was covered on top with planks that was covered with dirt, and then grass grew on that. So there were, as you can see, there are no windows. How does one survive in a bunker like that? I circled the air holes. there's a round hole. Oh, no, here it is. And then they snuck the pipe down and bent it into the, you see? So there were two on each side of the bunker. And I imagine that there were something for us to sleep on, though I really don't know. We were fed once a day. Somebody would come, and they fed us boiled grass and boiled roots, tulip roots. That was it. And okay, I'm getting a little bit lost, sorry. This hole in the ground, or the bunker as they called it, was done with the help of the underground, and there were numerous such places in the different woods in Holland where Jewish children were hidden. But I understand that our bunker was discovered, and I don't know what happened to the other children. Unfortunately, I tried to find the doctor, but without a name, they didn't give you any information whatsoever. My mother didn't even know where I was, because what you don't know, you can't divulge once they catch you. So I really wanted so much to reach out to him, to his family, said, look, I'm here, thank you. And I couldn't do it. So I was hidden in this bunker for almost 2 solid years. We were never taken above ground. I never saw the sky or the sun. And as I mentioned before, our nourishments consisted of boiled grasses and roots, and often our mouths were taped shut. Since the area was often patrolled and sound would carry through those air vents to above ground. My mother told me that she did not know where I was. And when she asked again, they told her it was better that she not know. So now I want to share with you a little bit about how I got out of this bunker eventually, and how I ended up coming to Terezin altogether. Aside from being a rabbinic pastor, a teacher, and a podiatric physician, I'm also a playwright and an actor. In the year 2000, the theater group that I was with brought our acting company to the Czech Republic, which in my school days was called Czechoslovakia, and to Hungary to perform a Holocaust play written by Jessica Litvak and called The Promised Land. It was to be performed at the Second International Jewish Arts Festival. For me, it was the beginning of a journey and a quest that had not yet ended and will most likely continue until I am no longer here. I had very little knowledge about the Holocaust or how my family was affected by this war, and mostly because no one in my Holocaust survivors' family talked about anything. My mother wouldn't. My father my mother married Bert, and they ended up in Israel. So my hope is that my memories and those of others like me, that you remember what I'm saying, and that you don't allow it to happen, and that your children don't allow it to happen ever again. And it's not just to Jews, guys. There are hate groups everywhere, and so many groups are targeted. So on this trip to Terezin concentration camp, I came face to face for the very first time with what happened to my father, Richard Levy, during the Holocaust. And I'm going to ask you to use your imagination for a moment. We were on a very bucolic road in the middle of the woods in the Czech Republic, on our way to Theresienstadt. The people on the bus were all Jews. It was the acting. Well, that's not true. The guy who played my husband was not. He was a Spanish hidden. His family had been a Spanish hidden Jew from generations back, when they ran away from the Inquisition. But I keep losing myself. I'm so sorry. I'm a little... Okay, so we are on that bus. And the Jews, the acting company, which were the actors and the directors of the company, the people who organized it, and a bunch of tourists who came along on this trip as well. And all of a sudden, our bus stopped in the middle of this woods, and we started to smell something burning. It's very ironic. It's eerily ironic. Here we are, a bus full of Jews, on our way to Terezin concentration camp, an extermination camp, in a city where not so very long ago, Jews were hunted down, tortured, killed, and burnt. And the smell of burn is in the air. It was really a little bit too much reality. They sent another bus, and we finally arrived at Terezin, or Theresienstadt. And the first thing we saw was a huge field of graves, each marked with a red rose bush, and they were flowering when we were there. In the front of this huge field was a cross, and towards the back was a huge Star of David. The plaques are marked not with names, but with numbers. Not the numbers of the people who, prisoners, but just so they knew how many there were. And the townspeople were actually brought to the grave pits where the bodies were just thrown in. And they had to find arms and legs and torso and heads and put them together into a simile of a body and then put them in the ground. So you don't know if it was the head of the body or the arms of the body or the legs of the body, but it was a body. So the day that we arrived there was cloudy and misty, and it's drizzling a fine misty rain and foggy, and the ground is wet and muddy. We walked through the courtyard, the first courtyard that we arrived at. This is the entrance, by the way. Stark black and white. I don't know if it looked like that when the original prisoners arrived at Terezin, but it looked like that when we were there. And it's really very, I don't know the words I'm looking for, it's shattering, you know, that's black and white and black and white. And you knew what was behind that wall. Yeah. And so we walked through the first courtyard, and so it looked like it was a prison courtyard, not necessarily the one that my father was in. And we passed at one time, we passed an open door, and in it I see cuffs coming out of the wall. And as you can see, the wall behind those cuffs is all raw. This was a torture room. The prisoners were cuffed to this, and of course, with my imagination, I immediately see my own father cuffed to that. And finally, our guide brings us to barracks number 4. That was where my father had lived. It is a long and narrow room with those hard and tiered wooden bunks that everyone has already seen photos of. Along 3 sides of the room, in the middle of the room, there's a narrow, long table with 2 benches on either side. And at the entrance of the room, there are 2 small toilets without doors. And I don't know if they ever had doors, but it really doesn't matter. The sides of the walls go up to the ceiling. The ceiling goes like that, and then in the center, it pitches up with opaque glass. That was the only source of light that came into the room. And this room was originally built to house 150 prisoners. It now held 600 prisoners, most of whom were severely ill with dysentery and typhus. Now, typhus is a highly infectious disease that causes high fevers, headaches, delirium, and death. And dysentery is an infection of the intestines. And since 2 small toilets were not sufficient, these prisoners now slept, ate, and sat in fecal material. Fecal vapor would rise up to the glass ceiling, condense, and rain back down on the prisoners in droplets. And all of a sudden, I found myself alone in that room. They all left, and I could not leave. I lingered behind. I walked around trying to touch every bit of surface that I could. I needed to touch where my father had touched. I wanted to stand with him and say, "I love you." But instead, I buried my face in my hands and said the mourner's Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. My sense of loss was acute and overpowering. This was my father's slave confinement. This was where he contacted the typhus, and this is where he was a slave. Barracks number 4 in Terezin was the last stop before he was sent to the extermination camp of Auschwitz, where he succumbed to the typhus. He was 32 years old. 32. His crime? He was born a Jew. This is my father, Bert. My father, Bert, met my mother while in the Jewish Brigade unit of the British Army. With his unit, he fought in Northern Africa and in Italy. My father, Bert, had no teeth because they had no water. All they had was the sugary syrup that fruit in the cans had, and that's what they drank, what they brushed their teeth with. Well, his teeth all rotted. So at night there stood the glass of water with his teeth in it. Bert and his other Brigada unit mates were so proud of their role during the war. They showed the world that Jews could be soldiers, that Jews could fight, and not just be meekly led to the slaughter. And not only that, these were the men who were the nucleus of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and fought for Israel to exist. A little bit about my rescue, and I'm almost done. At the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945, as the war was ending, only half of Holland was liberated, while the other half remained under Nazi rule. At this point, my mother and Bert were in the southern part of Holland, where Maastricht is, and had already been liberated. Through the underground again, Bert managed to commandeer a vehicle after they found out where I was, and they had to smuggle themselves over to the northern part of Holland. I was sort of told that that our underground bunker that I was in was discovered, and I know very little about all of that. I know that many of the children died. I don't know if any of them survived. I did. Bert managed, as I said, to commandeer a military vehicle, and they found me in the care of local nuns, more upstanders. And now they had to figure out how to smuggle me back down to Maastricht, to the liberated part. I had spent more than 2 years, or almost 2 years, in that bunker underneath the ground without my family, without seeing daylight, without breathing fresh air, without any human contact. My mother told me that when she rushed towards me, I screamed, petrified of the stranger that she was. As my mother began to share a little bit of what she went through. And by the way, I want you to know that she was forever broken. She never came back to the person that she was before the war, before all of this. She was a very sensitive human being, an artist, and spoiled rotten in her childhood. This was beyond anything that she could tolerate or live with. So at night I would hear her screaming. It was very hard. Another thing about my mother is that she could never hug me. She just couldn't. So I don't consciously remember my 2 years of hiding, but there are snatches and fragments of memories that surface here and there. They used to be incredibly bewildering to me before I joined the ADL's Hidden Child Foundation, and later the Hidden Infant Subgroup, which today I am the facilitator of. This is where I heard other stories echoing my own. And I realized that I was not quite as weird as I kept thinking I was. Others with similar backgrounds had very similar feelings, nightmares, and fears. I told you I was going to get back to Luxi, my mother's German Shepherd. When my family went into hiding, everyone into a different direction, they couldn't take Luxi along, Luxi the German Shepherd, and Luxi stayed behind. After the war, when my mother returned to her building, she was told by neighbors that the building was partially bombed, and Luxi refused to leave, no matter what. The neighbors didn't have any food to give her, and she slowly starved to death, waiting for her family to come home. It breaks your heart. Here's a totally innocent creature who was a casualty of this brutal war. My mother and Bert married in Holland. This is my grandfather and my Oma, and that's me at the age of 2-something. And shortly after that, my mother and I left for Palestine in an Exodus type ship. My father was still in the British Army, and not until 1948 did Palestine become known as Israel. A few months later, Bert found his own father, Opa Solomon, in a displaced persons camp and brought him to live with us in Israel. And Opa Solomon survived the death camp of Dachau, and he was not okay in his mind. I was very, very young, but even I could tell that he wasn't all there. And he once yelled at my mother for putting water in a pot while she was making soup. And he kept telling her that I was starving at Dachau, I was being starved, and why are you diluting my food with water? He didn't know. For me, he was a wonderful grandfather. He would talk to me. He gave me money when I refused to do homework or whatever it was that I didn't feel like doing. And he said to me always, what you have in here, they cannot take away from you. Very ironic, they did take it away from him. This is a crematoria. The man in the striped blazer is my grandfather Solomon, Opa Solomon. This is Dachau. And in 1948, in May of 1948, the state of Israel finally became a real sovereign country of its own. Now, I actually remember, because my father put me on his shoulders and was dancing in the street and loud music everywhere. Little did they know that the day after the war would start with their neighbors. But that day was a good day. This past August, I went with my family to Amsterdam to visit my other family, which has grown tremendously. And my son couldn't join us, but we have my 2 daughters, Lori here and Rona here, and my 3 grandsons right here, Jack, Matteo, and Luca. And if I'm going to try and point this out to you, right here, can you all see a black dot? Thank you. In Amsterdam, they have erected what they call the Names Monument. There are many, many names on this. They're all erected like this, one behind the other, or like that. And I found 11 people from my family who were on that wall, including my father. And we sat around, and I was finally able to say Kaddish for real for my father. Thank you. Okay, I'm glad.
Why don't you stay here for now, because we're live. Thank you for sharing that, Eliza. In 2018, for Father's Day, my daughter actually took me to Dachau, because it's something. Not of relatives being there, but of my interest in keeping this and not forgetting, not being there. And as you were talking about the forbidding experience of walking into the other camp, I have mentioned many times to friends the utter feeling of despair when you walk into a prison camp, and it's just to know that's where your family was, and it's thank you is all I could say. I know how difficult it is to share that. At this time, we do have a couple of proclamations. I have asked the people presenting to be short, not because those proclamations are not important, that we remember and that we pass on, but so that we could focus on the main parts of this evening. So I'd like to first call up representing Congressman Michael Lawler, Marta Rodriguez.
Hi. Representing Congressman Mike Lawler, who wanted to be here but couldn't make it tonight, we have a congressional proclamation for events like the Yom HaShoah. Commemoration offer a critical opportunity for education and reflection, enabling us to learn from the past and ensure that we never forget the lessons of the Holocaust. This important event brings together members of the community to honor the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and to promote a greater understanding and tolerance.
Next, I will ask our town clerk Diana Quast to come up with a proclamation from State Senator Pete Harcum.
I also just want to take a moment to thank the Flower House for the donations of the yellow daffodils, which are in remembrance of the children that perished in the Holocaust. Senator Pete Harcum wanted to recognize the town of Yorktown's Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony with a proclamation. I'm just going to read the last 2 sentences. Resolve that I, New York State Senate Pete Harcum, acknowledge the need for continued efforts to educate the community about our shared history, and be it further proclaimed that a copy of this proclamation be transmitted to the town of Yorktown. Thank you.
I would like to thank the clerk's office for all of taking care of the room and the setup for today's presentation and the refreshments in the back. I'll also at this time thank Robin Steinberg, who put together our program, and Jenabel Castro, who helped with some of the organization for today as well. Thank you. State Assemblyman Matt Slater. I was going to call Dana up separately, but she could come with Matt.
Well, I want to just begin by thanking the town of Yorktown. Councilman Lachterman has done this for quite a number of years now, and it is always so meaningful for everyone who participates, and it really does, I think, provide just such a great reminder of the realities of evil, the evil that we see in our world every single day, and I think it really challenges us to think about how would we respond if we were ever faced with such a grotesque evil as was described tonight. And I really hope and pray that if we ever put in this situation, we would choose humanity over politics every single time. And so with that, I do have a proclamation on behalf of myself and my colleague who also represents the town of Yorktown. We will not read it because it sounds very similar to the others, but to the town of Yorktown, to Supervisor Diana, the town board, all of our local elected officials, thank you for continuing this fantastic effort. And again, making sure that we don't forget, and making sure not only that we don't forget, but we teach, and we teach our children, and hopefully equip them with the same ability to defeat evil as was done in the past. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like Dana to take the microphone for a few minutes, being that she is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
Thank you so much, Ed, and also for putting this, to the town of Yorktown for putting this event together. And I also wanted to thank rabbinical pastor Dr. Eliza Erber for being here tonight to share her story. My story actually includes, I'm going to just tell you maybe briefly, if you don't mind, a very quick similar story, because my mother, Lori Bear, was a hidden child as well in Holland. Her family fled Frankfurt for Amsterdam in 1934, hoping to avoid the Nazi regime. Very quickly, I'm trying to... My sister actually put this together for a speaking engagement that she had recently during this week for recognizing Yom HaShoah. After the Netherlands fell to German occupation, my family's intelligence, charm, and courage and luck kept them safe from increasing Nazi persecution until 1943. My mother's grandmother, my great-grandfather, Julius, was abducted and taken to Bergen-Belsen, where he unfortunately died. And then in the wake of his abduction, my grandparents, Ernst and Edith, made the excruciating decision to entrust my mother to a couple that was involved with the Dutch resistance. My grandfather was actually involved in the underground, and he was a butcher, and he sometimes would use salamis to bribe the Nazis, and I think that also helped him. My mom was hidden on a farm in Oosterblokker with the Schouten family, who were extraordinarily brave, and maybe they did get paid. I don't actually know, but that was an interesting little detail that you shared. But as far as we know, they took my mother in, and she also was raised in a similar fashion to you, I guess, right? Not your mother, but you were the one. No, your mother, your mother was the one who was on the farm. She was also on a farm. She was also hidden in an area that was under the hay bales, which I've had the privilege of getting to visit because we did reconnect with the family. My grandparents found a placement with a different family, and it turns out that they were 8 miles away, which they didn't know until after the war when they were reunited. And my mother didn't actually want to go back to her parents after the war. She was 5. It was from when she was 5 until when she was 7. And when asked at the end of the war, I think much later on, one of the Schoutens, when he replied why did you do this? He said there was no other way. And basically, you know, it was families like these, righteous Christians, who were able to take those chances, as Dr. Erber pointed out, that saved us, and that's why I'm here today. So thankfully, all these families, the Shoutons and the Reese family, which where my grandparents were hidden, they were hidden in a little house with another couple, are honored as righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And I just know how important it is to keep telling these stories and keep them going. And we've been involved with the Hidden Child. My mother was also very involved with Hidden Child for many, many years. She's also about the same age, I guess, as your mom. She's turning 85 in August. And just very interesting that I just texted her to see if she knew you. She said she only knew people in New York and New Jersey. I said, Yorktown is in New York, Mom. Anyway, I don't know, but I'm sure we can find a connection. And anyway, just again, so important to tell the stories, to keep them going. Thank you to Dr. Erber. Thank you so much to Yorktown. Thank you to my colleague for making sure that we had a proclamation here tonight. So have a good night. Thank you.
Okay, and last but not least, our town supervisor, Tom Diana.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for coming here to this. I'd like to thank Ed, who puts on this very poignant day of remembrance. I think that we can watch these things on TV. We can read about them in books, but until you hear them firsthand, it really doesn't sink in. And you know, it's people like Dr. Eber and Ed that keeps these things alive for the education purposes. I would like to thank you, Doctor, for your presentation and education about the Holocaust here, so that people actually know what goes on. I was with a couple friends over the past couple of days, actually at the temple in Mayapack on Sunday, and they were Christian that went to Dachau, and they said that it made their hair on the back of their neck stand up when they walked into those particular rooms that you saw, and you felt the presence of your Father. So, that being said, Doctor, thank you so much. We have a little presentation for you also from Post 1009 of the American Legion and the Sons of the American Legion. We'd like to present you with a challenge coin from our veterans. And I'm coming to you. I'm going to come over to you. You sit right there. And just as an expression of the veteran thank you for enlightening people here. Thank you so much. This is on behalf of myself and the entire town board.
On behalf of the town board, Supervisor Diana felt it appropriate, instead of another proclamation, which once again is important, but to hang on a wall in town hall or somewhere, it would be much better served to do a certificate of appreciation to Eliza for her presentation. So that's what he just handed her. So thank you on behalf of all of us, Tom. Okay, at this time, I would like to start our candle lighting ceremony. As you can see, there are 6 candles on the table representing the 6 million Jews that perished in the Holocaust, as well as the 6 million others who perished. So we would like to start our first one with our survivor, Elisa. So our second candle is for the legacy of families of survivors. And as Lisa is also family of a survivor, we now have 3 other people, one that I knew was coming, former Supervisor Michael Grace. We also have Eugene Lang. And did Dana leave? Oh, well, so now we have two other survivors in the room. And if they could come up and with Dr. Erber, light the second candle. Elisa. Sorry. Thank you. So the next one, I think, Mr. Grace, if you could bring the next candle down. We do not have any liberating forces left with us right now, but the closest would be Anthony Grasso, who served in the 82nd, Tony? Second Armored, I'm sorry. Second Armored, and went into Europe right after World War II. As part of the cleanup of the concentration camps. And I will say, because he's not up here, Mike, could you spin that candle so the star is facing up? Thank you. I will say that anytime Tony talks about his experience, at 95 years young, he's 96 years young. Sorry, I still see tears in his eyes. So at this time, we have a contingency of veterans from both our American Legion and our VFW in honor of the armed forces who fought for the freedom of Europe. If I could ask you all to come up front. Yep. Are there any other veterans in the room right now? So the next candle is a very special one. For those of you that don't know, out of the 12 million murdered, as I learned today, it was 1.5 million that were children. So in honor of those children and of tomorrow's children, so they could live in a world of peace, I'd like to ask Jack and Lillian Gusikoff, who have been here every year, and I thank the Gusikoffs for really taking this to heart as a learning experience for their children. Also, Liam and Tristan Hogwat were going to be here, but Eliza felt that some of the subject matter was a little too strong, so Luciano, who would also be here with us, had to take them out. Thank you, guys. And for our final one, I would like everyone that is elected to the town board or the town including our clerk. We have Justice Raniolo here. Matt, I'm sorry, did Matt leave? Matt left too. Okay, well, I forgot to have him on here. Judge Avia Cohen-Pearson would be here, but she had court. But if you could all come up, the elected officials, and also representing our police department, Lieutenant Justin Foley, can you come up for the last candle? The last candle is honor of those charged with ensuring that this never happens again. Part of my speech may have sounded political, but it was not. It was about belief structure. And we hope that everyone running for office, everyone elected into office, guys, you light the last candle, Serge? Guys, you could go up. You got to go up with the candle. Thank you. Gary, Mary, I'll get this. We hope that everyone running for office remembers how important it is and how we are charged with the protection of our society. Okay. Thank you. And if you could all stay here, because we are going to ask at this time Rabbi Heber to come to the podium, and he will say a prayer for the candles today.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you, Eliza, for sharing your emotional story. We gathered tonight. We gathered to remember the millions of victims who perished in the horrors of the Holocaust. We remember the victims of the greatest crime of man against man, the young, the old, the innocent, the 1.5 million children brutally murdered because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone. What happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening. What happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image. We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what had happened, to the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks to the righteous of the nations who saved lives, as we heard in these stories, often at the risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. As we pay our tribute tonight, we call upon you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice as outlined in your holy Torah that says, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress the stranger. We know that while we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that while we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live. And so tonight we commit ourselves to Yizkor, to remembering. As per tradition, candles were lit for the memory of those who are no longer among the living. Why do we light a candle? A candle is comprised of two elements, a flame and a wick. The flame, symbolic of the soul, surges upward towards idealistic goals greater than itself. And the wick, the wax, keep it grounded, pulling it downward. This represents the human being, comprised of both body and soul. The soul is selfless. Its only desire is to live for a higher purpose by constantly giving to others and by fulfilling that which God expects from it. However remarkable this goal is, the soul cannot perform without a body through which it can express itself and communicate with others. The body is the soul's vehicle. When remembering those whose lives were cut short, the onus is upon the living to act as conduits for their souls. Each good deed we do in their memory brings joy and gladness to their souls in their current resting place and keeps their memories alive. Let us all accept upon ourselves an additional act of goodness and kindness, ensuring that those who perished have not died in vain. I will conclude with the Keil Mali Rachmim Memorial Prayer. I will ask if you can please rise. I will first say the prayer in Hebrew and translate it in English. El Mali Rachamim Shochein Bamroimim Hametzei Menucha Nechayin Al Kanfei Ashchina B'malais Kedoshim U'Tahirim Kizayar Harakira Mashirim Es Nishmais Adonai Hu Nachal Asam V'Yanuchu Al Mishkavei Sam B'Shalom V'Nomar Amen. God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest in your divine presence to all our holy and pure brethren, whose blood was spilled by the Nazi murderers in Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and other extermination camps, who were killed, strangled, burned, and buried alive for the sanctification of your name, for whose souls we now pray. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. May the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shadow of his wings for all eternity. And may he bind their souls in the bond of life. God is their heritage, and may they repose in peace in their resting places. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you. I will also say God bless the Lord's shepherds, especially the two that were here with us today, to help spread the word of peace and brotherhood and helping us to never forget. On behalf of our town, I would like to thank Dr. Erber for being here tonight and sharing her story. I want to give a special thank you to Supervisor Tom Diana, as he has been extremely supportive and has pushed for this program to continue so he can not only increase the town's knowledge but increase his own knowledge and learn from the past experiences of our survivors. I also want to thank you all for coming here tonight. Life is a precious thing, and tonight we heard a story from a woman that knows that more than any. It is important that we know what life is and that we embrace it. It's important that we share this as well. When you look at lack of respect for life in the world today and the reasons that people are killed, it is hard to comprehend how we get to that point. I think that it lies in the teaching, or should I say the lack of it. It is why we as a group have brought this program to you, so that we can remember where certain paths will lead. The spirit and desire to hear this story and share this story is why you have all come, so that we can spread the message of love and life instead of hate and death. It is only by this desire and this remembrance that hopefully we'll keep our children following the light instead of falling into darkness. Thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening.